Hello guys and welcome back, and as you can see we're in the digital stage, but you can also see that we finished the paper version. So if you guys missed all of that throughout the week, we've done this one live, so don't forget and check that one out and how we created this week's artwork. And as you voted over on Instagram for the Dark Phoenix this week, so again thank you very much for that vote, we are going to be now going into the digitizing stage of this week, and it is recorded, guys, so if you're watching and you want to leave a comment, then leave a comment down below in the comment section. You've got to scroll all the way to the bottom, right past the subscribe if you're new, and leave a like if you do. My name's Blut084, BLUT084, art and games, and yesterday I was live and did the construction lines for you guys to check out, and showed you which tools to use. As always, I'll give you a little bit of a heads up as I'm going through, but I don't always talk all the way through the videos, as sometimes if I talk I can't really concentrate on what I'm drawing or what I'm trying to sort of achieve. So what I have is a comic explained, or if it's not necessarily to do with comics, we'll have something else from the audiobook, but we also like a bit of comics, comic story. I couldn't remember what their name was there, but yeah, as we have listened to pretty much all of Comic Story and stuff at the moment, well, I thought we'd start going over to Comics Explained. It's like a brothers company, and we'll be listening to them as well. But don't forget to keep watching here on the sides. Shut up, Lexa, no one asked you. Because you'll be seeing the different layers that I'm using, as it's very important to have different layers for each part. I do apologise, I've just eaten my lunch, so if I burp. But yeah, we've got a background here. We can turn that off if we wanted, and then no longer it's there. We can then have something else underneath. We've got the colour layer, which is what we'll be doing today, and you can always add another layer if needed. So I'm going to call that colour 2 just for now, and have that over the top of the original, or the first version of colour, which we will be putting on in a minute. We'll be adding shading as well, so maybe I'll add that, call that shading or texture as well, just to remind myself that is where I'm going to be putting it, over the top of the main colour. Because if I do get to the point where I think, you know what, I could put colour in there, put shading in, I'm going to do that, because what I've been doing is colouring in one day and then shading in another. So if you can get it all in one go, and then maybe the last video this time on Sunday will be the light, so because there's going to be a lot of light in this picture, as you can see. It's the Dark Phoenix, but she's on she's a flame and a fire. Alright, so enough of me waffling on. Then you'll see why I don't waffle on. We'll get this going, and I'll get drawing, colouring, and doing all the texturing.
Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so continuing on with our video on the Uncanny X-Men, the Phoenix Saga, this is when things get interesting when it comes to Chris Claremont writing, because what he does, and this is kind of something that I want to sort of hit on here, is Chris Claremont will tell you a story, and like a whole bunch of things will happen in that story, but only one of the things that happen in that story will matter when it comes to the story arc that takes place like 20 issues down the line. And that's really the way his run worked when it came to like the Phoenix and the Dark Phoenix sagas. And the reason why I say that is because in the earlier issues, there were a couple characters, a couple concepts who were introduced. The first was the Starjammers, which debuted in Uncanny X-Men number 97. And we'll talk about that here in a little while. And the next was Eric the Red, Devon Shikari. Now, Eric the Red was actually a concept that was used by Cyclops in the earlier stories of the X-Men before Chris Claremont took over. And so, like, we'll kind of explain how that works with regards to Devon Shikari here in a second. But what this does is it picks up immediately in the aftermath of basically like the Phoenix, like the prelude to the Phoenix Saga, right? So if you want to get caught up, feel free to watch that video. But essentially, like, Jean Grey is now bonded with the Phoenix Force, and the space shuttle's crashed into Jamaica Bay. And when it landed down here, the big question everybody had is, what's going on with Jean? Because all she did was just suddenly manifest from the water and simply just shout, you know, like, I'm life incarnate, I am Phoenix. Her whole costume was changed, the whole 9 yards. And then shortly after that, literally, like, her mind was overwhelmed by what she was experiencing, and then she essentially collapsed. Now, between the panels, and what Chris Claremont doesn't really tell us, and what he kind of relies on us to understand, is that what Jean Grey is gets in possession of is an astronomical amount of power. That's one of the things that we've talked about when it comes to the Phoenix Force, that there's only one Phoenix Force in the whole multiverse, and in this instance, the Phoenix Force in its totality has bonded itself to Jean Grey, because the idea was that Jean Grey was the perfect host for the Phoenix. And so almost immediately after she collapses, the question the X-Men begin to have is, what's going on with her? Is she affected by the radiation that basically sent the space shuttle crashing down into Earth in the first place? They don't really know what to make of all this, because remember, they were basically unconscious and held in stasis pods when the whole merger between the Phoenix and Jean took place, you know, when that originally happened. So they don't know any of that stuff that's going on. So of course, basically, is Charles Xavier and the X-Men being whisked away, traveling out to visit Moira McTaggart, and then to in turn, like, you know, figure out what's going on Muir Island. Now, Moira McTaggart is a character who'd been around the X-Men for quite some time, and a little bit of explanation is needed here. She's been around the X-Men for quite some time, but Moira McTaggart is more of a mutant geneticist. Really, her and Xavier kind of work hand in hand, and in fact, she would play a pivotal role in essentially like leading into the formation of the New Mutants. But the way this worked, and even with X-Men Deadly Genesis, a story that came decades later, but really sort of gave her a much bigger role in the life of Xavier, is that when the two were kind of lovers at one point, the idea here was that, for the most part, if Xavier couldn't understand how a mutant's powers work, then he would hand them over to Moira McTaggart. She would analyze them, figure out how their power worked, and then give them back to Xavier so he could train them adequately. Now, of course, basically you have like, you know, Dr. Corbeau who comes out and says, hey, look, everything's gonna be cool. She's not dead. She's currently just kind of healing from whatever it was that she went through, but she'll make a full recovery. And that's when things really kind of begin to pick up and really start moving into the Phoenix Saga proper. But again, what this does is it leads into an interesting scenario, because for the most part, the X-Men get into a couple different fights. They get into a fight with Juggernaut and Black Tom Cassidy, and they get into a fight with Firelord, but for the most part, we didn't exactly know why. What ends up getting explained between issues 102 through 104, which we're really not going to go super in-depth into, is essentially that Eric the Red had been pitting like Magneto and Juggernaut and Black Tom Cassidy and Firelord all against the X-Men for the purposes of killing them, and the X-Men defeated them all quite readily. Now, for the character of Firelord, this is kind of important, and I want to have this conversation for a second. So, Firelord is a guy by the name of Pirius Krill. He's basically a Xandarian. The race that formed the Nova Corps is essentially where he's from. Now, the idea here was that somewhere along the line, where he was basically on like an explorer ship, essentially. His friend was kidnapped by Galactus. Eventually, Pirius caught up with him, only to find out his friend was turned into a herald and then died. And so Firelord became the new herald in his place. So eventually, what ends up happening is that Firelord basically travels to Earth, and then in the process, in Thor issues 226 through 228, I'm pretty sure it was a 3-issue story arc, Thor hands a destroyer armor over to Galactus, and in turn, Firelord gets his freedom. But the result is that, much like trying to duplicate the success of the Silver Surfer, the Firelord stays on Earth. This is part of the point where the Firelord is sitting on Earth, like where he's literally just kind of here exploring the world and all that kind of stuff, you know, different things like that, and kind of like understanding how humanity works and things along those lines. The issue here is that Firelord had simply just been duped by Eric the Red. That's really all it was. The Devon Shikari had gone to Firelord and say, hey, like, there's this group called the X-Men, and they're led by a guy named Xavier, and he wants to like take over the world and like enslave everybody, so like you should go and fight them. And Firelord, essentially being a hero, was like, yes. So like he races off and he's been fighting the X-Men the whole time, and that's really kind of where the battle between the two of them comes from. Now, one of the big plays, one of the big things where things really kind of begin to pick up here is what's really going on in the background. Is that while the X-Men are kind of distracted by Juggernaut, or at least they were distracted by Juggernaut and Black Tom before they were defeated, or they were distracted by Firelord and distracted by Magneto, this allows Eric the Red to make his move. But one big thing that came out of this, and this is actually a pretty significant scenario, one big thing that came out of this was that prior to this story arc, Magneto had essentially been de-aged into a child. And the reason why this mattered is because it was kind of a way for Marvel to essentially sort of reboot Magneto, kind of a soft reboot for his character. And then ultimately what ended up happening is that when Eric the Red showed up on Earth, I guess when he went to go out and grab Magneto, he'd been here for a while, but when he grabbed Magneto, he re-aged him back up to where basically an age equivalent to like Xavier and all them. And that's why when you go read Marvel Comics now, Magneto, despite having been alive during World War II, is not like 90 years old right now. At the same time that all this goes on, we really kind of get this other half of the equation, which is a character named Lilandra. Now, we didn't really know anything about her. Again, some of this stuff, you know, the idea of Lilandra takes place before the Phoenix Saga. But with Lilandra kind of popping up, there were a few things that happened with Xavier, whether he was fighting a different race, the Xenox, whatever the case was, his telepathic powers were, in a way, growing. And because of the fact that there was kind of a connection that was being forged between himself and Lilandra, she was literally, like, desperate to get away from her world, where she was kind of escaping on this sort of scout ship. Ultimately, she reached out to Xavier. Xavier picked up on her, but didn't quite know how to handle the situation, and didn't really know who she was. And so it's not really until this moment in the Phoenix Saga when she boards the teleportation device on her scout ship and teleports directly in front of Xavier as well as Jean Grey and a couple other people that she basically reveals who it is that she is, what her story is, or at least to some degree what she's about. Now, around the time that this happens, where Xavier's kind of understand what's going on and so on and so forth, then you suddenly got Firelord attacking, and then you've got Jean Grey manifesting the Phoenix Force, and then Firelord basically kind of like the two of them start, squaring off against each other. Now, this was kind of Claremont basically saying, like, here's the kind of power Jean possesses now. And that's the significance of the Phoenix Saga. The significance of the Phoenix Saga was kind of building the concepts up, building things up and saying, here's the power Jean has, here's what she's capable of right now, and then like her power's only ever going to grow. So for the most part, she's able to hold her own and in fact actually topple Firelord to a degree, but this allows Eric the Red to make his move. And what he basically does here is he kind of reveals his assignment as being an agent that was tasked to Earth by a guy named Dakin, an emperor of the Shi'ar Empire, and that somewhere along the line, Lilandra had come to blows with her brother Dakin, and then in turn like tried to flee the system. And then the result was that when it was established she was trying to come to Earth, that Eric the Red was alerted and said, hey look, capture her or kill the X-Men or do whatever you have to do, but get her and bring her back to the Shi'ar Empire, to our homeworld, so she can stand trial for her actions. And so what he basically does is he opens a Stargate. As soon as he opens the Stargate, he passes through with Lilandra and then it shuts. And Jean Grey, using all the powers of the Phoenix, channels all this cosmic energy into the Stargate, reopens it, and the X-Men pass through. And this leads directly into the X-Men essentially like arriving on the planet of the Shi'ar Empire. Now, when this happens, almost immediately, the X-Men begin coming to blows with the Imperial Guard. And the reason for this is because the Imperial Guard is the elite fighting force of the Shi'ar. That's really what they are. That when it comes to the Shi'ar Empire, they are essentially like an amalgamation of races. And so what this means is that when you have the Imperial Guard, it's literally an Imperial Guard. It's an elite fighting force composed of like some of the most capable races from across the entire section of the universe here in Marvel Comics. And so basically what ends up happening here is Lilandra finally spills the beans when there's a moment of reprieve between the X-Men and all the fighting that's going on. And what she basically says is that somewhere along the line, Dakin realized that there's an artifact out there called the M'Kraan Crystal. But the M'Kraan Crystal cannot just be traveled to and attained, right? You can't just jump into a ship, fly to the far side of the universe, take the M'Kraan Crystal out of its cradle and just be like, absolute power. It doesn't work that way. Instead, the M'Kraan Crystal is almost kind of in a sort of dimensional, little small dimension unto itself. And the way it works is that if the stars align correctly, a doorway opens once every million years. And when that happens, a person can pass through.
Adding another layer now, guys.
It's all just legend and hearsay. That the legend says if a person can basically can enter the M'Kraan Crystal and attain the power contained within, that basically they can go on to gain absolute power. Where Chris Claremont doesn't really explain it here, we can, because we kind of have the benefit of like all the stories that came after. And in a small little mini series, really a kind of a maxi series called Adventures of the X-Men, what Marvel did is they established the idea that the M'Kraan Crystal is essentially a hallway of doors. That when you enter the M'Kraan Crystal, that you can actually access other universes. But inside the M'Kraan Crystal is a city unto itself. Now the issue is that if the M'Kraan Crystal is pierced or in some way damaged or destroyed, it'll literally suck in the entire multiverse unto itself. And that's what happened in the Adventures of the X-Men. In the multiverse prior to this current one, that the M'Kraan Crystal was damaged by the Dweller in Darkness. And when that happened, it basically started sucking in the universe, the multiverse, the whole 9 yards, and then everything was recreated afterwards. And that's literally the legend or the story that Lilandra hits on, but doesn't actually specify, but that's what she's afraid of. That essentially like Dakin will either gain absolute power or he'll screw up and destroy the entire universe in the process. And so with this whole fight kind of going on between these two groups, that's when the Starjammers come into the equation. Now, the Starjammers are still ambiguous here, right? They've only been around for like a handful of issues, for something like 4 issues, and even then they only kind of appeared for a short time. So the basis behind the Starjammers, and particularly Corsair, has not been revealed yet. So those of you guys who do know the basis behind this, please do not spoil it in the comment section. But the Starjammers are really just space pirates. That's really it. But there is an actual history here between Corsair and the other members of the X-Men that like, again, we'll hit on in a later time. But basically what ends up happening here is it's kind of a repeat of what we saw much later on in the Adventures of the X-Men, when after the M'Kraan Crystal was pierced in that particular story, the Phoenix tried to unite the minds of all beings in existence in order to basically stop this. The result was that the M'Kraan Crystal couldn't be stopped. The destruction of the crystal and the end of the multiverse could not be prevented. But of course, Jean Grey doesn't know any of this, and so literally what she does with the M'Kraan Crystal and everything, and literally like with this power kind of manifesting the way that it is, with him being snatched directly to its location in this little dimensional area, that what ends up happening is there's these kind of pulses that are sent out. And when these pulses get sent out, for a fraction of a second, everything ceases to exist and then comes back. So imagine if Thanos like snapped his fingers and snapped again, and that's basically what happens, every single time a pulse is sent out by the Imkron crystal. Now the reason why this pulse is sent out is because one, is the Imkron crystal emanating itself, and two, because this is basically the arrival of Joff. I always thought it was Joff. Okay, the way this works is that because the Imkron crystal contains such extreme power that like a huge concern would be, what if somebody just walked up and took it and then just like ran amok in the universe? And so what ended up happening is there was basically a kind of security system put in place, that there was an agent, a protector of the Imkron crystal. And what ends up happening is that this guy Joff literally starts like crushing all of the X-Men, like just starts running through and essentially just like wrecking almost every last one of them. But Banshee is the one who figures it out. What Banshee realizes is that basically Joff made this statement about being programmed, that he was programmed for the purpose of protecting the Imkron crystal. If he's programmed, it means on some level he's a robot. And if he's a robot, he's got mechanical components. And so what Banshee ends up rationalizing here is that all he really has to do is just run up on Joff and then literally use his sonic scream to like disrupt all the mechanical components. And that's exactly what he does. He disrupts the mechanical components of Joff, which basically destroys him, and then they're met by Mott. And the way this works is kind of a cool revelation. The way this works is that there's Joff, who's the first guardian. Joff is the one who basically protects the Imkron crystal. If Joff is destroyed, then Mott will show up. And Mott's power is 1,000 times the power of Joff. If Mott's destroyed, then the next guardian will be 1,000 times the power of Mott, and it will keep going on. It's an infinite continuation of power until the individual who's there can be destroyed. Now, this is kind of the cool caveat to it, is that the design of this security system was to basically create kind of a dual riddle, kind of a riddle of sorts, is you face off against the Guardians, and they keep getting astronomically stronger, but they also get astronomically larger each time. The bigger they are, the easier they are to get around. And so they're really more of a distraction, to distract you from the reality that you can actually just run up on the crystal, because they're just so astronomically big. And that's exactly what happens, is the X-Men, Daken, all these different guys basically end up running up on the crystal, literally entering the crystal itself. And when they do, it's like this infinite expanse of space that's also confining at the same time, with a city on the inside. Now, this is essentially the White City, the city of like the White Phoenix of the Crown. Chris Claremont will not really establish this until we get into the Dark Phoenix saga, but that's basically what this is. It's the city in the center of the Imkron crystal, that the Phoenix resides here. It basically exists here. That whenever the Phoenix is not manifesting itself in a different universe, whenever it's not doing anything and it's going back to its base of operation, so to speak, to rest, this is where the Phoenix Force goes, the center of the Imkron crystal. And so again, it's kind of a cool thing, because when this happens, like literally there's a kind of security system here. Again, another stage of effect here. And what ends up going on is that as they approach it, they're all basically met by like a nightmarish experience, that literally all they do is just see the worst of their nightmares. So again, it's designed to basically keep people at bay. Now, the issue with this is that Jean Grey as the Phoenix is really the only one who can actually walk up on the Imkron crystal and is not affected by like the force of the security systems, which again is really kind of Chris Claremont's way of saying like she's supposed to be here. And so when she goes through here and she starts analyzing the Imkron crystal and figuring out what's going on, what she basically starts doing is talking about like a lattice work and different things like that. For people who are reading through that, it can seem very confusing. So the easiest way to think about it is like this. The Imkron crystal has a huge source of energy, and basically it's like this small little neutron galaxy on the inside. Basically, like if the Imkron crystal were to be pierced, everything would be sucked in. What stops that from happening? Imagine like a chain link fence running around the Imkron crystal. So long as that fence is there and it contains the energy of the Imkron crystal, everything will be fine. The issue is that with the crystal being pierced, that chain link fence is now damaged, which means that power is leaking out. It's like having a pinhole leak in a wall with like a gazillion gallons of water behind it, right? Like with all that pressure, it's only a matter of time before it blows a hole in the wall. And that's basically what Jean Grey's realizing here. This lattice work is damaged, but because there's so much power confined behind this lattice work, even though it's like a small little tear, it's a small little piece of damage, it's only a matter of time before all this energy just explodes outward and then starts sucking everything in. And so what she ends up doing is kind of banning the spirits, essentially, of like all the X-Men together, and then using the power of the Phoenix to essentially go through and like repair this lattice work. And what it does is essentially fix the Imkron crystal. Now, this is why this is so important, because for somebody kind of looking at this and just sort of skimming through it, the reality is that it doesn't really seem like anything happens. The reason why is because the truth of the Phoenix Saga is that it's a prelude. The Phoenix Saga is a prelude to the Dark Phoenix Saga. The Phoenix Saga is basically designed to say, okay guys, so like Jean Grey's astronomically powerful now, but like what would happen if she became a bad guy? Like that's basically what it is. And like all the stories that take place between the Phoenix Saga and the Dark Phoenix Saga are designed to focus on that, designed to lead up to it. So like the Hellfire Club and all those different things, so on and so forth, it's all designed to lead into that. But this story is so significant because it was designed for the purpose of basically taking Jean Grey, who is one of the weakest characters of all time, and then throw her into becoming the most powerful member of the X-Men, and in fact, one of the most powerful beings in the entirety of the Marvel Universe. But it's a cool story. It's a cool little set of events. The result here is that after it's all said and done, Lilandra cannot return to the Shi'ar Empire, right? Like she's essentially exiled. She's banished. And so she's confined to Earth and ends up staying with the X-Men for quite some time. The Starjammers are also a part of the equation now, which means we'll also see some emphasis on the Starjammers as a focus on them and the role they play. But it's, again, kind of a prelude. So everything that comes after this leads directly into the Dark Phoenix saga proper. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.
Okay, so we're getting to that point where I'll tell you what I've done so far. Hopefully you can see what I've done so far. Let's zoom out. And what you can see is I've put in a little bit of shading. And I've moved my mic there. You see,
make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing.
Just a second, I'm going to check what we got playing next, because we've got in a playlist and I'm not sure if it's going to be the next in the issue. Again, I can't do anything about this still. I haven't got no editing software. Oh goodness me, it's Rise of the Dark Phoenix. So let's leave that playing. But I'll turn that back on in a moment. So what I was saying is we put a little bit of shading, sort of shading. Hopefully you'll see what I'm trying to do towards the end of it. But so we've done the clothing first, and we've done it on different layers. So we've got the shading on top of the main color layers, and then underneath we'll have like, that was going to be the skin layer, but I wanted to put a t-shirt in there. We've also got to do the necklace sort of piece of it. I don't know if it's a necklace or a collar to the top she's wearing. But yeah, I'm going to be deleting all the bad bits of this. You'll see where I put the shading in. Oh, no, that's the wrong layer. What layer am I meant to be on here? Let's go to the colour layer. So let's get rid of all the bits that overlapped. And that's again another good thing of digital. If you do need to go over with your brush that you're using, or your tool that you're using, you can do. I'm getting too close there. Zooming in is also another favourite of mine. Because when I'm drawing, I want to get close, but I can't always get close enough to the piece of paper. Especially if I'm live, because all you'll see is my head. No one wants to see that. Trying out the tools as well, because I was always using the same tools. I want to start using different ones. So I've sort of started on the paints ones at the minute. I don't know what they look like. I don't know if they are any good, to be honest. For me personally, for what I'm trying to do, they're probably good enough for you if you know how to paint. I have no idea how to paint. I usually get a paintbrush and just splash on what I've already drawn on. So I'm basically colouring it in like I do would normally, but I would do with pen. With what I would do with pen, but I would do it with paint. Use my illustrations and paint them, sort of thing. What do you do? Let me know in the comments. Right, yeah. So there's that deleted off. We can kind of see where I'm going for. I'm now going to go over here, do these pieces. Then I'm going to do this here, the sash, and then I might do the skin tone afterwards, and then while I get into the fire effect around the whole character. The hair is going to be quite fiery as well, as you can see in the picture I drew. It's a little bit more difficult for me to get the same effect using a mouse than it is to use a pen or a stylus, which I don't have. Let's get that playing in the background, and I'll carry on doing what I'm doing. Watch the layers on the side and tell you which ones I'm using.
No, And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so as promised, we are getting into Dark Phoenix in time for the movie's release. So again, like what we talked about in the previous video when we covered the Phoenix Saga, is that there are some things that take place between the Phoenix and Dark Phoenix sagas, but the weird thing is that it's kind of hit and miss, right? Like it's the nature of the beast. And so because of that, we're actually going to kind of go back and hit on some of the finer points before, I guess, as we go through this story, or at least the first part of it. And then we'll kind of pick up with the Grand Poobah events and the arrival of the Dark Phoenix and all that kind of good stuff. So initially, really when it comes to Dark Phoenix Saga, this runs between Uncanny X-Men issues 129 and 138. But the brunt of all the stuff really kind of happens in the later bit. And so with this beginning part right here, we initially pick up with like Banshee and Cyclops and Jean, as well as Moira McTaggart. Now, there were a couple of things that went on here, and really a couple of reasons why this is being done the way that it is. So Banshee, as we know, is Sean Cassidy. He basically has the ability to emit kind of a sonic scream, not really on the same level as Black Bolt of the Inhumans. His scream can do anything between like, shatter rocks and allow him to fly, to shatter mountains, different things like that, but it's by no means like planet destroying. But the idea behind this is that really in the couple issues running up to this, we ended up dealing with a villain named Proteus. Now Proteus is Kevin McTaggart, who's actually the son of a guy named Joe and Moira McTaggart herself. The way this played out was that Kevin's powers really has a power to manipulate reality, but only on a limited space. So imagine if like Franklin Richards of the Fantastic Four, the son of Reed Richards, could only manipulate reality within like a 1 mile sphere of himself or something like that. That's basically what Proteus did. He can do anything, but just within that limited space. But because his powers are so extreme, and because his power, nobody really knew how to handle him, he was essentially kind of locked away for a time. Now, this ended up resulting in like some crazy pirate guy, some boat guy who was a dick, who just had problems with Moira McTaggart, showing up on the doorstep and like breaking into their home. And then as soon as that happened, he ended up freeing Proteus by accident, and then Proteus basically took over the guy's body, right? Because when it comes to Kevin, because his powers are so extreme, the human body can't handle them. Now, this is something I want to talk about for a second, because this is not something you really see anymore in Marvel Comics. Back in the 1970s, 80s, and even in the early 90s, you had such a thing as powers that were so extreme that a normal human body couldn't handle them. And this is really a way for a writer to essentially create a villain or hero and then kind of transcend them from the human element and then move them into a much greater thing, right? To basically say they can always make their return. Apocalypse was like that. Proteus was like that. The original X-Men, Nate Gray, was like that. The problem is Marvel never brought him back. And when they did, he basically came back as Jesus in a story arc that no one's reading right now. But with this tidbit here, Proteus is just a character whose powers are wildly extreme. Now, ultimately, because of the fact that he has these sort of energy bonds, more or less, metal disrupts that. And so it eventually came down to like Colossus, along with a couple X-Men, who ended up defeating him, and then it was believed he was dead. Now, he's not, but at the time this story was being written, it's believed that Proteus was dead. And so what this did is it allowed Chris Claremont to kind of write out Banshee and Moira McTaggart, not in the sense you'll never see them again, but at the same time this was going on, you had Black Tom Cassidy, who was related to Banshee, and was actually raising Teresa, Siren, who's the daughter of Banshee. And so because of that, it kind of allowed Claremont to sort of go into that story arc and keep the two of them somewhat removed. I mean, again, Banshee was kind of hit and miss, but Moira McTaggart, it also kind of tie into like the New Mutants and all that kind of good stuff. So again, there was a lot leading up to this in terms of what came out of the Phoenix Saga and the Dark Phoenix Saga. Now, this is when we really start getting into Dark Phoenix and in the events that lead up to that, when the X-Men are just kind of taking off and heading back to the X-Men mansion, and then suddenly Jean Grey is basically psychically assaulted by not really assaulted, but like psychically bombarded by Jason Wyngarde. Now, Jason Wyngarde is not new here. Jason Wyngarde has been around for a long time. In fact, he was part of Magneto's original Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, which faced off against the X-Men in issue number 4, I think it was, by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And so when this happens, Jason Wyngarde has found success as part of a group called the Hellfire Club. Now, the Hellfire Club exists in two forms. You have the Hellfire Club itself, and then you have the Inner Circle. The actual Hellfire Club is more of a front, right? Like they're just a super wealthy, well-to-do organization. But the Inner Circle basically exists to just kind of collect power as much as they can, as much power as they can, right? So like they influence governments, they influence companies. The only company they haven't really been able to gain a foothold in, I think, is Roxxon Oil. But outside of that, they influence almost everybody. But when it was realized by Emma Frost, who we'll actually pick up with here in a minute, but when it was realized by her that Jean Grey was the Phoenix and possessed an insane amount of power, then it became, we can bend her to our will. And so because Jason Wyngarde has the power to manipulate the five senses and make you believe that everything that you're seeing, touching, tasting, hearing, and smelling is absolutely real, then what they could do is use him as a means to ensnare Jean Grey. The problem with this is you're talking about a being with the power of a god, right? So it's like if Jason Wyngarde tried to use his powers on Galactus. By himself, it wouldn't work. And so a device was created by Emma Frost that would basically amplify the power of Jason Wyngarde and would in turn allow him to ensnare Jean. And that's what happens. Now, this is one of the big things that kind of comes out of this, is it's little bit by little bit, right? If he had just like full on psychically assaulted Jean, then like it wouldn't work, right? Because she would have immediately picked up that something was wrong, and then it would have just, it all would have gone belly up for the Hellfire Club. Instead, it's bit by bit. It's small moment here, small moment there. It's these little glimpses, right? Like these small little moments where Jason Wyngarde will basically like trick her mind into believing that she's on like a Victorian era ship, and like the two of them are lovers, and like Cyclops is just some goofball who's trying to get in the way, and like that's it. And for her, she believes it's 100% true. Now, there's two forces operating here, right? I mean, there's two forces that are going on here. The first, of course, is Jean herself, who's easily ensnared, but the second is the Phoenix, who could block all that from Jean, but is curious. And so that's why these things really work in conjunction with what it is that Jason Wyngarde's trying to do. And so again, that's when we start to pick up with like the introduction of Kitty Pryde, which again, is kind of a small little thing. And that's the nature of Claremont's stories, right? I mean, Kitty Pryde kind of gets introduced here and she's brought into the X-Men, but that's basically it. It's just kind of like, here's a future member of the team. That's the way Claremont did things, right? Claremont would introduce a character and then give them a huge moment, right? Where Kitty Pryde gets introduced here, in like 3 issues after the events of Dark Phoenix Saga, Days of Future Past kicks up. So she immediately gets a great big huge role in Days of Future Past. So it goes on to show that she will become a significant member of the X-Men. That's how Claremont did things. So with this particular event, of course, she's being recruited by both Emma Frost as part of the Massachusetts Academy, and then Xavier as part of the School for Gifted Youngsters. Now, with Emma Frost and the Massachusetts Academy, that'll eventually become home to the Hellions, which is basically Emma Frost's own variation of like the New Mutants slash, X-Men, kind of an amalgamation of those. Eventually, all the Hellions will be massacred, and then she'll end up leaving and becoming a good guy. But at the outset here in this moment, she's kind of a rival to a degree to Charles Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters, but she's really raising like villains more so than she's like raising raising heroes, if that makes any sense. But it's just one of the many things that kind of went into Claremont writing, that like there's a lot of things kind of going on here. And so what this does is it leads to Emma Frost and the Hellfire Club basically going through and capturing the X-Men, and they managed to pull it off quite readily. Now that's another important thing to bear in mind, is that with the Hellfire Club, they almost never go into anything blind, right? Like they almost never go in having no idea what's going on or how to win. And so with Emma Frost leading the charge as like one of the most powerful telepaths in the world, and depending on what story arc you're reading, sometimes more powerful than Charles Xavier, we saw that in Civil War. The idea behind this is that like using all the information they have on how the X-Men work and how they function, they end up taking Colossus, Storm, and Wolverine. Now of course again, this leaves an opening for Kitty Pryde to basically join in and kind of say, hey look, I can help rescue the X-Men and prove my worth. But again, it's kind of bouncing back and forth here, small little moments here and there, little tidbits. And so getting a bit of a reprieve, this is when things really start to get interesting, is getting a bit of a reprieve and kind of going on and doing a bit to sort of spend time among themselves, as well as investigate what's basically the Hellfire Club. You end up having Jean Grey and Scott Summers, who go to a local bar, or a local disco as it's called, which is actually the headlining act is Dazzler, which is kind of interesting. She can manipulate light basically, but with the two of them going through there, of course, they're immediately bombarded by Jason Wyngarde again, at least Jean is. And so with this kind of going down, this whole scenario plays out where like Jason Wyngarde shows up and says, hey, like we remember each other, we were lovers, all that kind of good stuff, and kind of again being teleported back into the moment. Jean Grey just sort of says, yeah, like I mean, I remember you, we're definitely lovers. And the two of them actually end up getting married, and she basically kind of goes forward as what seems to sort of be this villainous version of herself, or at least Jason Wyngarde kind of pulls her in and sends her that direction. Now, that's the motivation of Wyngarde, right? I mean, if we kind of hadn't made that clear at this moment, that's the motivation of Wyngarde. That in the mind of Jason, everybody kind of has the devil inside them, right? It's the aspect of themselves that's looking to cut loose and just sort of break all the rules, right? I mean, it's bad boys and bad girls, They kind of realize that some rules can be bent, others can be broken, to quote the Matrix. With this being the case, with Jason Wyngarde preying on Jean, what he's looking to do is unlock the darker side of her, right? The part that just kind of wants to spin out and just do whatever it is that she wants to do, because then what the Hellfire Club can do is indulge those desires, which, to create, havoc and to tear down worlds, whatever it is they want to do. They can use her as a means to kind of take over the world, more or less. The problem with this is that, again, where she's having a mental flashback, keep in mind that it's only her mind that's experiencing this. She's not physically being transported into the past to a Victorian era landscape. And so in this moment where Jason Wyngarde's there and he goes to kiss Jean, she does it in front of Cyclops. And that's when Cyclops begins to realize, okay, something's actually wrong here. Now, of course, Cyclops doesn't necessarily bail out on her, although he's very close to doing it. But at the time that all begins to happen, of course, the Hellfire Club makes their move, attacking Jean, attacking Cyclops, and Dazzler as well. Now again, Dazzler's introduction here is just kind of, hey look, I can manipulate lights and stuff like that. I don't know that I'm a mutant. They basically, Cyclops says, yes, you are, and you have these powers. You should come hang out with us, and so on and so forth. It all kind of wraps up pretty fast, right? Like it's not super intense. But again, focusing on Jean, focusing on the Hellfire Club, that's when they begin to kind of ask the question, okay, what's going on here? Like what's happening with Jean? And it's kind of interesting because Jean doesn't necessarily tell Cyclops what's going on. And that's kind of interesting here, right? Because what Jean is experiencing is what's essentially an affair, right? I mean, like what kind of goes on here is actually almost what went on, or almost identical to what went on with Grant Morrison's new X-Men, right? Where like Cyclops engages in a psychic affair with Emma Frost, and the two of them actually sleep together in Cyclops' mind, and Jean Grey kind of walks in. But in this particular situation, she's not telling it. Like she's not like, yeah, there's this guy who's like psychically assaulting my mind and like tricking me into believing that I'm in like, a Victorian era landscape or something like that. Because not even Jean fully realizes what she's going on. And there's actually kind of an emotional attachment there, right? Like what Jean's basically doing is she spent her whole life with like the Boy Scout, right? The guy who never breaks the rules, always does the right thing, so on and so forth. And that's cool, I guess. But then now she's basically got kind of like this bad boy in her life, right? Like I can take you away from like this boring life that you live and bring you into something better. And she kind of wants to take it. But again, it's one part Jean who's sort of swept up in this emotional turmoil, and then it's the Phoenix that's sort of feeding on it, right? So even if Jean wanted to walk away, she probably couldn't. Now, of course, you've also got Emma Frost, who's basically defeating, who's captured the other X-Men, and then you've got, Kitty Pryde, who kind of sneaks in and basically frees like Wolverine, which in turn goes through and allows Wolverine to free everybody else, and then you have the rest of the X-Men who arrive on the scene, all of whom end up, doing battle with Emma Frost. But this is kind of cool because this is really where Jean begins to shift, right? Like this is where she begins to move away from the superhero that we knew her as, and starts to kind of lightly indulge in her darker side, which basically confirms to Jason Wyngarde that what he's doing is working. She ends up getting into a psychic battle of sorts with Emma Frost, and where the other X-Men are freeing each other and they're trying to make their escape and so on and so forth, Jean actually kind of all out assaults Emma and almost like destroys her mind in the process. Now, under normal circumstances and coming out of the Phoenix Saga, when that event ended and Jean realized the full totality of the power she possessed and what she could do with it, she put these blocks in place, right? She's like, okay, there's a huge amount of power here, but I'm going to restrain myself so that I never lose control, because if I do, God only knows what could happen. I could wipe out the Earth and the entire solar system, presumably the entire galaxy. I'm in possession of an infinite source of power from like across the omniverse. So like I can't just let things go and do whatever it is that I want to do. But in this moment, in this fight with Emma, Jean doesn't care. She just lets loose. And when that happens, like it almost completely eradicates and kills Emma Frost. And that's one of the things that Cyclops picks up on. He starts talking to Storm and he's like, hey, look, I don't know if you noticed, but like with Jean Grey, she is pretty dangerous now. Like she's really kind of snapping and losing control, and we have to be aware of what's going on. And so in response to this, and really kind of as a follow-up, the X-Men begin investigating the Hellfire Club, right? They kind of go in there and say, okay, we have to figure out what's happening. And it's kind of a funny moment here, right? Because like as soon as they get in there, Jason Wyngarde strikes again. And when that happens, like Jean Grey is totally ensnared, right? Like it's the last fig leaf, right? It's the last thing. Jean Grey is now no longer in a mindset where she's in love with Cyclops. She's totally ensnared by Jason Wyngarde. Now she sees Jason Wyngarde as he wants to be seen. And so when he ends up leading her away, it's kind of crazy because like he ends up taking her upstairs. And it's like, okay, Cyclops, so like some guy basically just like grabbed your girl and she's going upstairs with him. Now you got one of two choices, man. You can be a punk and just be like, well, I mean, I guess she really likes him. Or you can go up there and get your girl. And that's exactly what you need to do, man. You're gonna let another man off with your woman, then you didn't deserve to have her in the first place, man. You gotta fight for the things you love, folks. Sometimes you get beat up, sometimes you get a black eye, sometimes you get all kinds of messed up. But you just fight for the things that you care for. Fight for the things that matter to you. And Cyclops does. The problem is that Cyclops is a punk. No, he's not. But actually, the problem is that Cyclops is facing the power of a god. That's the problem the Cyclops has. And so like when he goes running up on Jean, she completely blasts him with like a huge portion of the Phoenix's energy. Now, not enough to kill him, right? But like at this moment, it's when the rest of the Hellfire Club make their move, right? Because the X-Men respond, the Hellfire Club responds back. And that's when we start to get like these really cool explanations on what the various members can do. So beginning with Sebastian Shaw. Sebastian Shaw is a guy who can essentially absorb an unlimited amount of energy, kinetic, or I guess, really any kind of energy, and then like channel it into like physical strength, right? So for those of you guys who remember Nox from Heroes, the black guy, think of him, except instead of fear, he can absorb just like, physical energy, right? So like physical punches, blasts that aren't powerful enough to like destroy his physical body, and it turns into physical strength. It amps him up. And so really it's very difficult to destroy him. It would take somebody with an extreme level of power to destroy Sebastian Shaw. Again, it's only physical strength. So like what you saw in X-Men First Class, I think it was, with the Kevin Bacon Sebastian Shaw, that was just Fox screwing things up, which they're really known for doing. But what you also have here is you've got a guy by the name of Donald Pierce. Now, a lot of you guys know the name from the Logan film, the guy who was basically responsible, or at least had a hand in creating like X-23, and who was chasing after her and Wolverine and so on. Donald Pierce eventually goes on to join the Reavers, but what none of the members of the Hellfire Club know right now is that while Donald Pierce is part of the Hellfire Club and they are essentially mutants, Donald Pierce hates mutants, and he's actually using the Hellfire Club as a means to try to like push his own agenda, acquire power unto himself so he can launch a campaign to kill mutants wherever he can find them. Now, of course, ultimately it doesn't work, and Donald Pierce, being half machine, is cast out and then eventually joins the Reavers, where he's really been ever since. Those of you guys who are reading the current X-Men run, that's really where a lot of that comes from, is it really kind of starts here. But then you also have Harry Leland. And I always felt like Harry Leland was one of the most underestimated members of the Hellfire Club, if not one of the most underestimated characters in Marvel, right? Like, he was so cool, and no one after Claremont really seemed to do anything with it. So what Harry Leland can do is he can actually increase the mass or decrease the mass of an object around him, right? So like he can make Wolverine weigh tons, right? So he's like Graviton to a degree, but he can make Wolverine weigh tons, right? So like, Harry Leland against the Incredible Hulk, depending on what happens, you might see it play out the exact same way you saw Graviton and the Incredible Hulk face off against each other in the Avengers cartoon show, right? Where like Graviton just starts increasing the gravitational pull around the Incredible Hulk. Instead, what Leland does is he would increase the Hulk's mass, right? So if Bruce Banner turns into the Hulk and he weighs 600 pounds, Leland can come along and say, actually, you weigh 5,000 pounds now, and just increases his mass to an extreme degree, which would actually be kind of a cool fight. But you guys understand why Leland was painfully underestimated in Marvel, and he was painfully underused. It was terrible. He would make such a great character in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? Like, imagine the characters of the MCU all end up showing up to the Hellfire Club, and like suddenly none of them can move, and like they all weigh thousands of pounds. They weigh so much that actually they begin to just kind of crush under their own weight. That's what Leland can do. Like, that's why he's so awesome. But again, the X-Men are pretty much taken apart quick, fast, and in a hurry by the Hellfire Club. The only exception is Wolverine. This is something I want you guys to notice too, because this is the cool thing about Claremont writing, is that when Wolverine fights Leland, he's basically just like made to weigh a ton of weight and then starts crashing through the building down into the sewer systems, and then Leland walks away. That's the way Claremont would do things, and that's cool because you don't see that in story arcs now, right? Like Wolverine would show back up again and fight Leland, and then like they would win all in the same story. Claremont actually extends that to the next issue and says, okay, so like Wolverine's defeated right now, but like he's gonna come back, and Wolverine by himself is gonna go rescue Jean Grey. Now, at the outset, and just kind of looking at this, it's just kind of like, okay, so Wolverine's fighting by himself, whatever. But Wolverine's fighting for love. And that's one of the cool things that Claremont had built up. That's one of the reasons why his writing always paid off, is because with Wolverine basically going back and intending to like rescue his friends in the X-Men, that he's doing it because he's in love with Jean, painfully in love with her, right? I mean, it's kind of the love triangle between himself and Cyclops and Jean Grey. So he's going there mainly to rescue her, but to also rescue the other members of the X-Men. Now, the other part of this is that it really kind of shows this perception of Jean in terms of how it's viewed from the mind of Jason, or from her mind by virtue of Jason Wingard, is that where the X-Men are just kind of tied up and they have these inhibitor belts around them and they can't use their powers or anything like that, and they're standing in like a modern day room, and the perception of Jean's mind, they're criminals. That they're basically, people that tried to break in, they tried to take what belonged to her, and they have to be dealt with and so on and so forth. Her whole vision is skewed. And again, that's the nature of Jason Wingard. Now, a person who's a telepath like Charles Xavier, or a person like Jean Grey who wouldn't be in such a fractured mindset right now, would normally be able to oversee this, would normally be able to like realize what's going on. Now, if this was like Charles Xavier and Charles Xavier walked in on this, he would be like, what is going on here? And he would use his powers and be like, Jean, you have to see, this is the way, it's not the way things are, and that would basically be it. But with Jean Grey's mind being fractured, with like the Phoenix really sort of just like absorbing and taking in all these emotional feelings, Jean Grey never had a chance. And so that's kind of the cool thing, is because in this moment, in this fraction of a second where she's basically almost totally ensnared by Jason Wingard, this fraction of herself, this tiny itty bitty version of herself, which is still kind of maintaining this psychic connection with Cyclops, manages to signal to his brain and say, hey, like, I'm still here. I can't do anything. I'm totally ensnared. Like, there's nothing I can really do here. I'm almost totally ensnared. I can't escape from this, but you can. And in that moment, what ends up happening is the lock or whatever it is on Cyclops' neck essentially snaps. Now, this is kind of the cool thing about that, is that when it snaps and when it breaks, it essentially frees Cyclops, right? Like, it basically allows Cyclops to go free. But this is the important thing, and this is why this happens. And it's one of the most important moments throughout the entire entirety of this story. With Cyclops being held captive, Jean Grey for the most part doesn't care, because it's just, this is a guy that's there. It doesn't really matter. But remember, ever since the two of them first met, and really Claremont built on this, is that there's a kind of psychic bond between Jean Grey and Cyclops that nobody else has. So like, no matter what happens to the other, they are always aware of what's going on with the other person. It's really kind of forged in their love, right? Like, they'll always know what's going on. They can sense when something's off. Jean Grey doesn't even have to use her powers to know. She doesn't have to use her powers to know there's something wrong with Cyclops. The connection really kind of tells her. The psychic bond weakens, or like it begins to kind of fracture a little bit when he starts to get distant. That's when we kind of know that things are wrong, that something's not working the way it's supposed to. And so with this little bit of a moment happening, the reason why this works out for Cyclops, the reason why the lock on his neck snaps and so on, is because with the Phoenix incapacitating Cyclops, and with him fighting against Jason Wyngarde and then presumably being killed, or at least Jason Wyngarde using his powers to make Jean believe that Cyclops has been killed, this is the breaking point. Because what Jean Grey's experiencing now is basically the feeling of loss, losing the best thing she ever knew, the one man she's in love with among every other man in existence. The Phoenix has never felt this before. The Phoenix doesn't know what it's like to experience the loss of a loved one, someone you're hopelessly in love with. The Phoenix has never experienced that. There's a lot of emotions the Phoenix hasn't experienced, at least at the time this story was written. Now, future stories came later on down the line that kind of went back and changed a lot of this by introducing new things, right? Like the Phoenix was in love with Odin and so on and so forth. But at the time this story is being written, the information that we had, the Phoenix had never experienced any of these things before. And so what's happened here is the Phoenix is kind of one with Jean Grey, right? Like Jean Grey feels love, the Phoenix
Going into the
love.
dodge tool now. You see what I do?
The Phoenix is in love with
It'll shade it in.
You know, Jean Grey likes the X-Men, the Phoenix likes the X-Men. You know, Cyclops dies,
Soften the
the
edges.
Phoenix feels the power of losing someone she loves, and the Phoenix snaps. She just loses her mind. Like she literally breaks. And that's when all hell begins to break loose. Because as soon as that happens, the Phoenix immediately turns on Jason Wyngarde and says, like, I see what you've been doing now. Like, I get this ruse that you've been playing. You've been manipulating me, you've been lying to me, you've been cheating me, like you've been tricking me into seeing things that aren't really there. So if what you want, Jason Wyngarde, is to experience the power of a god, then I will give it to you in its full totality. And so the Dark Phoenix runs up on Jason Wyngarde and basically gives him cosmic awareness. In the blink of an eye, he sees the entirety of all things in existence, all throughout the infinite expanse of all space and time. He sees it all at once. And because of that, because he's not prepared for it, it's totally overwhelming. Now here's the important thing to bear in mind here, is people will look at that and they'll say, yeah, but like Quasar Wendell Vaughn got that and it wasn't overwhelming, you know, and like Phyla Vell, she became like the new Quasar and that wasn't overwhelming. Captain Marvel got that and it wasn't overwhelming. Well, because Marvel's usually very particular about who gets it, right? So it's usually like a slow build up to experiencing that kind of level of like cosmic awareness and being aware of what's going on in all things at the same time. And, you know, either that or it's someone who kind of like eases them into it, right? Like when Wendell Vaughn got that, he was eased into it by the cosmic entity Eon, right? He was just kind of like, okay, so like, just so you know, what you're about to see is going to be some crazy stuff. So just like breathe and like everything will be okay, but like you're about to see the whole universe. Bam, you know, and they would just like throw it on him. But you know, for this situation, Jason Wyngarde has never experienced anything like that. So he's blasted with all existence at the same time, which overwhelms him and actually sends him into a catatonic state where he will remain for quite some time. So in the moment, you know, kind of in the aftermath of this, the rest of the X-Men basically band together. They manage to make their escape from the Hellfire Club. Everything seems okay. And then the Dark Phoenix manifests. The Dark Phoenix is totally overwhelmed by everything she's been experiencing. And it says, like, Jean Grey is gone now. There is no Jean Grey. There's none of that stuff. I am the Dark Phoenix, and all of you are going to die. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. And yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace. What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so I want to be dangerous for the next week. I want to try an experiment for the next week. I've actually been thinking about doing this for a little while, and I've been trying to find a way to see if we can make it work. So what we're going to do for this whole week is we're going to cover the event of Fear itself. And this is going to be like a background series of videos in addition to the videos that we normally do. The exception, of course, is today because it's Sunday. And so normally we would cover we should be covering X-Men and Green Lantern, but I've been getting a house remodeled and all kinds of good stuff, and that went on the back burner, and I'm going to do this instead. So I'm kind of curious to see how people will respond to this. Now, Fear itself is an interesting story. Here's a funny thing about this. So when Joe Quesada took over Marvel Comics in the early 2000s as editor-in-chief, basically from 2000 going forward, it was designed to like rework everything, right? And then we went into Siege, and then we had like Dark Reign, Siege, the Heroic Age, and then we go into Fear itself. And the Heroic Age was designed to basically say, here's heroes being heroes. Initially, it was like that. Like all these different characters and teams got one-shots, and then you had like the actual Heroic Age miniseries and so on and so forth. But it didn't last all that long because in reality, people had kind of liked the darker tone of storytelling. Like stories like Civil War, Secret Invasion, things like that. People somewhat enjoyed that. The other half of this was that by the time 2011 and 2012 came around, Marvel was planning out Secret Wars. And so the result was that Jonathan Hickman's Avengers, the New Avengers, picked up shortly after this and then just started going forward with the collapse of the multiverse. So there wasn't really a whole lot of time to sort of restore heroes back to what they're supposed to be, quote unquote. Instead, it was just kind of picking up, sticking with what worked, and then eventually going into Secret Wars, which led into all different Marvel. Now, initially what this does is this picks up with the character of Sin. Now, Cynthia Smith is the daughter of Red Skull, and her character originally appeared back in Captain America Comics in issue number 290. We're really 289 going into 290. But she was basically this idea that Red Skull wanted an heir for himself. And so with this in mind, what ended up happening here is that Cynthia Schmidt was basically brainwashed, more or less. Now, the original intention of Red Skull was to kill her because she wasn't a boy, but ultimately her life was spared, and he started raising her to become his new protege. Now, this comes after Ed Brubaker's Captain America run. And the reason why I say that, the reason why it matters is because during that run, that included basically the conclusion of Civil War, the events that went into the death of Captain America, the return of Bucky Barnes, Red Skull having a cosmic cube, different things like that, but ultimately resulted in quote-unquote Red Skull dying. And so Cynthia Schmidt, it was really kind of her chance to shine, and it was a way to bring her in and have her go forward as a potential replacement for the Red Skull, which of course, as we know, didn't work. That's one of the things. You read comics long enough, one of the things you learn is that nothing ever stays changed forever. And so in this instance, what she's done is she's allied herself with Baron Zemo. Now, what they've done is they've discovered the Book of the Skull. And the Book of the Skull basically housed various secrets that Red Skull kept hidden and various sources of power that he was never able to use for one reason or another. Now, this ultimately leads into them basically accessing the bunker of Red Skull. And then once they get in, Cynthia Schmidt begins to basically sort of reveal this tale. And what we end up finding out is that in the 1940s, during World War II, that the Red Skull had essentially traveled to a section of Atlanta, really in Germany, but had brought Atlantean mystics to him, and in turn basically forced them to start using their various forms of magics in order to access a sort of super weapon out there that would serve the purpose of allowing the Germans to basically win World War II. Now, the other half of this is the invaders themselves, because with this going on, essentially the artifact that's been summoned, more or less, by Red Skull has flown across the sky and landed somewhere else, meaning they have to go chase it down. Now, this ultimately leads to them basically accessing where the Red Skull was operating out of, just because of the fact that word had reached their ears that strange things were going on, and the invaders were literally jumping from, like, basically following the trail of the Germans and liberating all the camps that they could come across. And so when Namor steps in here and ends up finding out that all the members of these various Atlanteans have essentially all been killed, it's a big to-do. Because one of the things to remember is that when it comes to Namor, he is fiercely protective of his people. As Prince, as basically the ruler of Atlantis, he'll go to the ends of the earth. Now, from here, picking up with Red Skull, as well as the rest of these German forces, once they arrive here, you've also got the invaders hot on their trail. Because by this point, the various folks in Germany had basically said, hey, look, here's what was going on with the Red Skull and various magics and so on and so forth. But this item had basically crash landed in Antarctica, and the initial indication is that it's a hammer, because Red Skull cannot pick it up. He can't lift it. Now, this is not the hammer of Thor. This is a totally secret hammer that no one's ever known about before. And so the result here is that Red Skull's response is to basically say, no one can know about this outside of us. Basically, if you tell anybody, I'll kill you. Not only that, like, build a fortress, do whatever you have to do, but your job is to study this thing and learn how to use its power. Now, the big takeaway from this is that, one, this is indeed a hammer. Two, Red Skull basically lies to Von Strucker and everybody else when he says, this is explicitly for the Fuhrer. None of you guys are supposed to know about this thing. This is not for your eyes to see, when in reality, it was never moved, it was never lifted, because it couldn't couldn't be lifted by Red Skull or anybody else. And so when Cynthia finishes telling this story to Baron Zemo, what she ends up doing is basically saying, like, this is, what I have here is a map, a location of where this hammer is. Because, accessing this tomb, again, only really reveals information. It doesn't actually reveal any particularly powerful artifacts. And so Cynthia essentially betrays Helmut Zemo and takes off to find the hammer for herself. And so at this point, we jump forward to the actual Fear itself story. So again, we're going to do this very similar to Civil War, in the sense that you've got the tie-ins and you've got like the main event itself. Now, this is where Fear itself really begins to give us what it was that Joe Quesada and company were shooting for, in the sense that, like Civil War, it was designed to be a reflection of the modern day. Now, this is in 2010, 2011, and so we're talking about right before the point when, like, housing prices after the mortgage crisis had reached bare bottom, when it had basically like dropped off to the lowest point and then began the point of recovery. And so what you have here are a lot of people who are just angry, right? I mean, that's the nature of this. While this story isn't really political, it is designed to basically take these political tones from the real world and feed them into the story, right? Like, you had the mortgage crisis in 2008, Americans almost destroyed the economy, Obama told the American people, sorry about your luck, bailed out the banks, and that was the end of that. And so with this whole thing going forward, what you have are people who are in a state of anger and resentment and who are lashing out accordingly. But the funny thing about this is that Steve Rogers basically catches on to this small nuanced thing and essentially says people are more aggressive than they normally would be. And so where he's kind of looking at all this, the initial response is something's wrong. Things aren't right here. Something's going on here. This also leads to the various armed forces tear gassing protesters, because as we know, civil disobedience is still disobedience. And so of course they're basically all tear gassed and they're knocked out for a time, or at the very least subdued, and things kind of return to a state of normalcy. Now, picking back up with Sin and traveling to Antarctica, this massive citadel of sorts has basically been constructed. Not only that, what she says is that all these scientists from World War II are currently occupied inside this place, that they've been stuck here the entire time, and they have no idea of what's been going on outside in the real world. They don't know the war has ended. They don't know that Red Skull is basically dead. They don't know any of that stuff. As far as they're aware, they're still operating on orders from the Red Skull. And what they've been doing is studying this hammer the entire time. But in the end, it's all to no avail. They haven't figured out a way to lift it. They haven't figured out a way to tap into its power. It's just a thing that's there, and they're basically doing the same thing day in and day out. And so what ends up happening here is that Sin basically approaches the hammer, picks it up, and immediately switches over. She basically starts calling herself Scotty. Now, the reason why is because that's the actual inscription on the hammer itself. It's basically that hammer's name. And so where she dons this hammer, she begins going forward saying, we're going to seek out its, basically its father, its owner, and then go from there. Now, at this point, this is when we start to switch over into Iron Man basically rebuilding Asgard. And it's actually a pretty cool thing, because remember, this comes after the events of Siege, which come after the events of Dark Reign. So Norman Osborn's already been deposed, right? He's already been toppled, been defeated, and Dark Reign is over. He's no longer in control of S.H.I.E.L.D. But for the most part, the purpose of Dark Reign and even the events of Siege was to basically disband and to remove the entirety of the Superhuman Registration Act. That was basically a holdover from the events of Civil War. Essentially, it was the Marvel Comics equivalent of somebody just sort of letting their voice trail off. It would just kind of be something that was never really referenced anymore, kind of forgotten, and fans would eventually ask the question, what happened to the Registration Act? And Marvel wouldn't want to have to release a one-shot or go through a whole bunch of hoops in order to provide an answer to that question. And so in this instance, what ends up happening here is with the Registration Act gone, Captain America Steve Rogers is long since back. He's been reborn after the events of his death. And this basically leads into Iron Man chipping up and essentially saying, while this does seem kind of weird, at the end of the day, it is people acting aggressively. That's really all it is, because all these tests are being done to ask the question, is it some kind of external factor? Is there some psychic mutant out there that's going crazy and using their powers? Is it some villain? Did Mysterio make it all happen? And there's no answer to that. It's not the actions of any one person that push these people to the extreme. It's just that they're just really that pissed off. And so the response of Iron Man basically looking at Captain America is saying, after World War II was over, what did you guys do? You guys built things. You had the economic explosion of the United States in the 1950s. And so his response is to say, we need to do the same thing. You have people right now who basically feel like they were ripped off, left hanging. What they need is to be put to work. What they need is to be able to do something with the auspices that they can make the world better. And so the result is that Iron Man says, we're going to get them to work. Asgard's been destroyed. It was destroyed by the Sentry during Siege, so let's build a new one. I told them I would, so let's just start, let's get to work on building a new Asgard. And that's what everybody starts to do. Now, this is kind of a background thing. Instead, it's basically Iron Man getting out there and telling the world, here's what we're going to do. We're going to rebuild the entirety of Asgard. Now, the reason why this matters is that for those of you guys who you are reading Thor comics right now, what you'll notice is that there's two Asgards. There's basically old Asgard, which also exists in the dimension of Asgard. Then there's Asgardia, which is hovering out there around Saturn somewhere. The one that's around Saturn, that's the one that Iron Man built. And so again, with Scotty traveling down to where this particular being is located at, she basically starts facing off against all these various monsters and demons that have been placed there by Odin as kind of a measure of protection. Now, when it comes to Asgardian magic, it gets a little iffy. It's really a plot device more than anything else. Captain America might be able to overcome Asgardian magic in one story, and then he's just hopelessly powerless against it in another story. In this instance, these kind of beasts and monsters being placed here, we would have to believe are most likely beings that none of the superheroes would be able to successfully defeat on their own. And so that's why Scatty's here, is because she's going through and literally tearing them limb from limb, using this hammer, ripping them apart, only to find out there's basically a kind of sarcophagus with a seal of sorts on it. And when she penetrates this seal and enters into the inside, into this sort of, tomb, more or less, she's met by the arrival of a guy who refers to himself as the Allfather, saying that, like, he's the rightful ruler of Asgard. So it's a pretty cool thing, because when that happens, Odin basically says, this is it. This is the prophecy that I've been trying to avoid for all this time. The serpent has finally made his return. And so it's interesting here, because when Thor comes along and basically starts conversing with his father, the two of them start getting really, really aggressive, because Thor's idea is, look, we should be standing next to the.
And that's why you have different layers, guys. You'll see in a minute.
Find a way to rebuild
because I had it on
Asgard.
this
For
layer,
Odin,
I
it's
would
really more
have deleted
pride
the
than
whole
anything
thing
else.
if I
And
wanted
that's
to change
always
the
been
colour of the
about his
background,
character.
which
The
I
way
do
that
want to
Odin's
do.
been written in Marvel Comics, it's always been that he's exceedingly prideful, in the sense that he's like, Asgardian business is Asgardian business, and we do not air our dirty laundry. But for Thor, he's walking the middle of the road. He's an Avenger on one side and an Asgardian on the other. And when the question was asked earlier, which one would he choose, Asgardians or man, he chooses man. And so the result here is that he's kind of taken a stance against Odin. Now, where Thor pops up with Mjolnir and it's just kind of like, look, if that's how you want to be, then we can take this to the mattresses and I can beat the hell out of you with the hammer. It's basically Odin responding by saying, hammer drop. Do not allow Thor to lift you. Now, it's small things like this that really go towards the idea of Thor becoming unworthy. When Thor first lost the ability to wield his hammer, not only could Thor not lift it, Odin couldn't lift it. The hammer had basically had a will of its own. It was doing its own thing. Now, of course, we know the answer to that now, but at the time, at the time we didn't. And that was the nature of the hammer in response to how the Asgardian mythos functioned. That while it was the hammer that Thor wielded, it was basically passed on to him by Odin. And the enchantment that Odin placed on it was that only a worthy person could wield it. And so the response that Odin makes is that he gives and he takes away. And so basically, it's one of these things. By the grace of me goes your ability to wield that hammer. And this is a significant moment, because it shows just how much more powerful Odin is than Thor. Regardless, what ends up happening is Odin basically says, we're departing this place. We don't need humanity's aid. We're leaving this place and we're going back to Asgard. And so again, it's interesting, because switching back over to Skadi, and with this guy, basically the serpent, her response is, if what you're looking to do is topple the Asgardians and essentially conquer the world, is this something that can be done by us? And the response he gives is, it will not just be us. It's going to be those who I deem to be worthy. And so what he does is he basically summons a handful of hammers, which are going to land in different places on Earth, and various people are going to pick them up, and they're going to become the worthy, basically the followers of the serpent, and in turn, like, be imbued with all new levels of powers, each one representing a different facet of what the serpent stands for. And so while all this is going on, essentially Earth is under siege by hidden Asgardian powers that no one really seemed to be aware of before outside of Odin. And in the moment when they could use the help of the Asgardians, they leave. Odin instructs all of them to walk away. And so they're all basically being taken back to Asgard. Thor himself is being forced back there, and Earth is being left to the defense of the superheroes who were there. And that's really about it. So we are continuing on with Fear itself, and yeah, Fear, it is a really cool story. It is a pretty badass story. At this point, we pick up with Journey into Mystery. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, Journey into Mystery, originally it was like a sci-fi story. It was a series of, like, science fiction, mystery comics, whatever. And then Thor appeared. And then Thor was so popular that eventually Journey into Mystery became the Thor line of comics. For the most part, when Journey into Mystery was brought back, it basically revolved around Loki. And the reason for that, again, came out of Siege. And this is part of the things that we've talked about in the past, where we've said that Marvel does soft reboots, which is to say they shuffle up a character, they change status quos, but they don't do hard line reboots, despite the fact they need to. In this instance, what ended up happening is that during the events of Siege on Asgard, in Thor issue number 617, which was actually part of the aftermath to Siege, we ended up discovering that what Loki had done is he had gone to Hela, who was basically the ruler of the Asgardian afterlife, and it essentially, like, bartered things, so that he could basically return to life when his physical form died. And so what ended up happening after this was that in Thor 617, Loki came back, but he was a little kid. And he
Okay,
had no
guys.
knowledge of anything he had done when he was in.
We have reached the point where I'm going to stop the recording and save it all so it doesn't corrupt my system, because if I go over an hour, then some reason the recording doesn't save properly. So here's where I'm going to be stopping. So hopefully you have seen everything you want to see for the first part of this, as adding in just the basic colours and putting a little bit of shading here and there. In the next video I'll put in full shading in, adding the fire effect with the lights effect, and the using lots of dodge tools and loads of other different tools, guys. So keep watching, keep tuned, don't forget to subscribe and click the links that will appear. Thanks for watching. I've been Blut084, BLUT084, Art and Games. See you next time.